G'day gamers, Ranger Tony here with another Pathfinder Kingmaker build video. Today we're going to look at a Sorcerer build. So the Sorcerer is an arcane spellcaster, meaning they cast magical spells rather than divine or god-given spells. And they are considered a spontaneous caster, meaning that they don't have to study or memorize their spells before they cast them. They are limited, though, in the number of spells that they know, and they can't learn new spells from scrolls or spellbooks. But they have the freedom to cast the spells that they do know in whatever combinations they want. So, for example, if I know Magic Missile, I can cast 4 first-level spells per day, then I can cast Magic Missile up to 4 times without a problem. As opposed to a wizard who would have to prepare Magic Missile 4 times and then rest to be able to cast it 4 times. Okay, so this is a greater flexibility, but again, you learn less spells, so you need to be careful about which spells you choose. Now, generally, sorcerers are considered to be battle-focused mages doing ranged damage. You could build a support sorcerer if you wanted, but for this build, we're going to focus on ranged damage. So I generally make a big deal in my videos about race selection, but to be honest, any race can play any class and make it work. You may remember, however, that I've always talked about halflings and gnomes and their penalties that they get due to using smaller weapons. Well, as an arcane spellcaster, you don't have this problem. The small races do the same amount of spell damage as any other race. So I'm going to choose Halfling for this build. Now, we're still going to have the standard issue with playing a Halfling, or either of the small races, in that you have diminished carrying capacity and you've got less movement speed. But you do have some advantages. You're going to get a +1 to your armor class. You're going to get a +1 to your attack rolls versus medium or larger opponents. You're going to get a +1 to your save throws, and in fact a +2 on your save versus fear because of your bravery, or fearless as it's called. You're also going to get +2 to some of the skills, athletics, mobility, and perception, if you choose to take those, but they're not that great as skills for a sorcerer, so you might not end up taking those. So let's have a look at the sorcerer then. What makes the sorcerer stand out, I guess, is their bloodline. Now, technically, all of the sorcerers have a bloodline, but for the Imperial, the Sylvan, and the Sage, you don't get to choose the bloodline. Whereas with the default sorcerer that we're going to choose now, you do. So let's have a look at the bloodlines. Now, I loosely bunch these into 3 types of bloodlines, or maybe 4. So there's a couple of things that don't really fit into any other category. The first one is the arcane bloodline, where you essentially have magic in your blood, and the other ones are the serpentine and the undead don't really sort of fit. So serpentine, you have some sort of serpent race, I think the Nagus they're called, is it, in your bloodline, and then undead in your bloodline. But the 3 main sort of groups that I group them into anyway are otherworldly, which is the abyssal, celestial, fey, and infernal. Right, so abyssal and infernal are demon and devil based, ancestry, heritage. The celestial is godly heritage, basically. And then the fey bloodline is fey heritage. And that one, if you were to pick a gnome, for example, that might be one that you might choose to pick because it's sort of, gnomes are meant to be fey as well. Having said that, I don't really like any of these bloodlines. The next group then are the draconic bloodlines. And if you want to level up into the prestige class of Dragon Disciple, you need to pick a draconic bloodline. You used to be able to. There was a bug in the early versions of the game where I believe you could pick any bloodline and go to Dragon Disciple. Now you must choose a draconic bloodline. Okay, so draconic bloodlines. Basically, if you're not aware, dragons are split into 2 main groups. Actually, I believe in Pathfinder it might be more than 2, but there's 2 groups here. There's the chromatic or color dragons and the metallic dragons. So the chromatic dragons, the black, the blue, the green, the red, and the white, they are all evil dragons, okay? And the differences between them are what type of breath weapon they do, which is based on their color. The metallic dragons are similar, but they are all good. So you've got brass, bronze, copper, gold, and silver. Now, as far as the bloodlines go, they're all essentially the same. So if we look at the black bloodline, for example, you get the same thing across all of them. It's just the elemental focus that you get that's different. So you get the ability to grow claws, which, I'm not, being a battle mage for ranged damage, I'm not going to want to use those claws. You get extra damage to the elemental focus of your dragon type. So in this case, it's acid damage, so you get an extra point of acid damage. You get perception. You get resistance to that element type, acid, for example. You get mage armor. You get resist energy of that particular type. You get dispel magic. You get fear. You get spell resistance. And then you start getting the dragonkind ability, which for a limited amount of time you can basically transform into a small dragon. You do actually get wings that you get all the time. And you're basically, getting a lot of these powers that are revolved around dragons. But with all of the dragon types, the only things that really change is this elemental focus that you see in these couple of abilities. So, that will be either acid, fire, electrical, or cold, frost. And that will just depend on the dragon type. So that's the draconic. The last type of bloodlines that are here is the elemental bloodlines. And I actually prefer these, at least for this type of sorcerer, I prefer the elemental bloodlines. So in a lot of ways, they're similar to the draconic ones in that they all basically get the same abilities. They are just focused on a different element. So air is electricity, earth is acid, fire is, of course, fire, and water is cold or frost. So as this type, you get, at first level, an elemental ray. And I think this, while it's not a great spell, at first level, it's a really good advantage. It does 1d6 points of damage, and it does +1 for every 2 levels that you have. So even at 20th level, this is going to be a fairly low-powered spell. It's only going to attack a single target, and it's only going to do 11 to 16 points of damage. So it's not, at 20th level, you're doing huge amounts of damage from spells to multiple opponents. So it's not that great. But at first level, the fact that you can cast it 3 plus your charisma modifier times per day, if you started with a charisma of 18, that gives you a +4, which means you can cast this 7 times a day. That's 7 more spells that you can cast. So that's a really good starting ability. That's why I like these elemental bloodlines. You also get mobility, which is nice if you're going to focus on that. You get resistance to that type of energy, so in this case electrical. You get a Burning Hands spell that is an electrical version of Burning Hands. So, and you get that for free. So that's a great little spell. You get Scorching Ray, the elemental version of that at 5th level. You get protection from energy. You get Elemental Blast. You then start to get these elemental bodies, which allow you to, for a brief time, to transform into an elemental. And then eventually you get Summon Monster, and finally you get Elemental Swarm and Elemental Body. So you're getting a lot of powerful abilities here as an elemental bloodline. So I'm going to take the elemental, but I'm going to take Earth, mostly because acid is one of the things that fewer opponents, as far as I'm aware, are resistant to. So it doesn't necessarily mean you'll do more damage. It means there's just less chance that they will be able to save versus the damage that you're doing. So I'm going to choose that, but you can choose any of the 4. You can even analyze what sort of spells you're going to get available and look at it and go, well, you know what? Overall, if I choose these groups of spells at each level, you might look at it and go, you know what? Electrical spells seem to be it. They're what do more damage in the long run. Therefore, I'm going to pick air. I haven't done that. I may come back and do that another time and do another video where I point that out. But for now, I'm going to pick Earth for this build. The ability points. So the primary attribute for a sorcerer is charisma. So you're going to need to set this as high as you can. The higher your charisma, the higher the spell level you can access. So it's 10 plus whatever spell level you're trying to go to. So if you want to be able to cast 9th level spells, you need to have a charisma of 19. I recommend really starting at least 17. You're only going to have 5 points that you can add into this later. And if you don't add in points soon enough, you're going to be able to cast spells, but your charisma is not going to be high enough to be able to get to that level yet. So I recommend starting at least 17. For this build, I'm going to do 18. Your charisma gives you access to a small number of extra spells per day. So at 18, I think you get 1 extra spell per day, but you've got to wait until you get to, I think, 20 or 22 before you get a second spell per day at certain levels. The other thing is the higher your charisma is, the harder it is for your opponents to save against that spell. So keeping your charisma as high as possible will make it harder for your opponents to defend against your spells. So we'll start at 18. The other attribute I recommend is dexterity. Now the reason for this is that most of the damage dealing spells you're going to do are going to want to be ranged spells. So this means that you have to build this similar to any other ranged character, like my archer builds. You will need to learn point blank shot and precise shot to negate any penalties when casting ranged spells. So we're going to set the dexterity. In this case, we're going to set it to 18 as well. You could probably set it to 16 and it wouldn't be too bad, but 18 will give you an extra point of armor class as well. It's up to you, but I think 18 is a good number here as well. We only have a few points left. Okay, so as a halfling, we could throw those points into strength to try and negate some of our issues with carrying capacity and strength overall. I could add them to intelligence to get a couple of extra skill points, but the problem is that I'd only get 1 extra skill point, even though I'd be able to put 4 points in. That would use all 5 ability points. So that would give me a +2, but it only gives you 1 extra skill point. So I don't know if that really is enough for me. Instead, even though this character is definitely not going to be in the front lines, I think hit points is probably a good go here. So I'm going to throw all of those in there and give myself a couple of extra hit points per level. Skills. You've only got 2 points of skills here, so you really need to be considerate as to what you're going to do. I personally believe that you're just better off at this point using both of the charisma-based skills. Use magic devices. That will give you a lot of extra flexibility in your character. You'll be able to cast from a lot more scrolls than you normally would, so you'll be able to use some clerical scrolls, for example, and you'll be able to use wands and things like that really, really easily. And then persuasion, not perception. Now, if you use a different race, say you went human and you get an extra skill point, or you decide to put some points into intelligence to get an extra skill point, what would you go with? Well, as a halfling, remember you get bonuses to athletics, mobility, and perception. And in fact, this elemental build will also have a bonus to mobility. So you could throw a point into mobility and see it starts at 10, so that's very, very good. Or you could go perception. You don't get any class bonuses to that, but you've got your +1 or +2 from being a halfling. It's really up to you. The other things, because you're not intelligence-based, things like Knowledge Arcana are not really going to be your thing. You're going to be slower than that. So you're really going to have to base it on what ability points you've got bonuses in. So something like mobility or even trickery would be a good option if you had an extra point to throw around. But I'm going to stick with use magic device and persuasion. So, feats. Okay. I'll do a full list of feats here that I sort of recommend at the various levels. At first level, you're really going to want point blank shot, okay? Because we need that so that we can get precise shot, but we can't get precise shot yet because we don't have the base attack bonus of 1 that we need to be able to get that. So we're going to have to wait until 3rd level for that. What else should we then take? We get a bonus sorcerer feat that is from a very reduced list. Spell focus might seem like a good option here. The problem with spell focus is that you focus on a school of magic, and you really have to do your homework for that and work out which spells from a particular school you're more likely to use. As a sorcerer, though, and in particular as an elemental sorcerer, you're more focused on one element type, not on one school of magic. And you can't be guaranteed that it's only one school that all of the spells of that element type exist in. So I actually recommend taking elemental focus here, which gives you a +1 to the difficulty of save throws against your spells for that particular type. So in this case, we'll pick acid because that's the type of spells that we're focusing on. And that's what I would recommend for any of these elemental builds. So then at level 3, you should be able to take precise shot at that point. So take it and you'll then be able to hit better into melee. Remember, you're going to be focusing on spells that do ranged damage here. That's what you should really be focusing on. They might not all be acid-based spells, but you don't want to be getting too close to your opponents because remember, even though you've got 2 extra hit points, you're not a frontline fighter. You're not going to be much good, and you can't wear armor, so your armor class is always going to be very poor. There's spells that can help with that, but you're not going to be a tank. So focus on those spells that give you ranged attacks, and so then that's why at level 5 I would say take weapon focus in raise. So you may not realize this, but you can actually take weapon focus in raise, which gives you that ranged attack. Okay, so you get a +1 then to hit with those range attacks. Greater elemental focus at level 7. That will further make your spells harder to defend against. And you get a bonus, another one of these bonuses then at level 7. Actually, there's a different set. It's these feats that you see here at the bottom. And so you're going to want to probably take dodge out of that group there. At level 9, I recommend taking spell penetration. So this gives you a +2 to your caster level when determining whether your spell is able to penetrate defenses. Some creatures have defenses against spells, and you have to use your caster's level to determine whether you successfully penetrate their defenses, and this gives you a +2 to that. So then at level 11, you can take greater spell penetration. I would recommend doing that. The reason we're taking those as early as we are is just to be sure that we've got them as soon as we can, so that we can be doing as much damage to any resistant enemies as possible. We could have taken it a little bit earlier, but I wanted to get those bonuses to the elemental damage and to hit in as soon as we could. At level 13, this is where it starts getting interesting. There's a few different ways you can go here. I'm suggesting either taking a couple of teamwork feats here, particularly if you plan to have a couple of spellcasters in your group. Now, I'm playing around with a party at the moment that is all sorcerers. And so this teamwork feat will work well. So allied spellcaster, it increases your spell penetration if there's 2 of you casting spells at the same opponent. The other option, though, if you don't want to go down the teamwork route and you don't plan on having someone else with those abilities, because you have to have at least 2 party members with those abilities for it to work, is consider some of the meta feats, the meta magic feats, and in this case, reach spell. It increases the range of any spell. So a touch-based spell could now be cast at short range, a short range spell at medium, a medium at long, and long gets extended. It does mean you have to cast the spell as a higher level, though, and it depends on how much further you want to push the reach of that spell. But it does mean that, for example, you could do Burning Hands at long range, but that would increase its spell level at 3 or 4 times. So that's one to consider. I'm not big on these meta magic ones, but they are useful. You get another bonus skill from the list that we saw before at level 13 as well. I would take Improved Initiative. At level 15, if you're going down the teamwork route, Shielded Caster works well. It improves your armor class, and it also improves your combat defense bonuses and things like that. You don't have to have another caster doing this. You can have, say, a fighter who has Shielded Caster, and that works well with the caster themselves. I do think, though, they need to be within a certain distance of each other, so you might have to be careful about that. If you don't want to go to the teamwork for that one, consider taking the Quicker spell meta feat. And what that does is reduce the casting time of a spell. So if it's a spell that would normally be able to cast as a standard action, you can now cast it as a swift action, which means you can essentially cast 2 spells per round rather than 1. Any spell that would take a round or more to cast, though, you can't do as a quicker spell. Level 17, I would suggest taking something like Heightened Spell, which allows you to cast the spell as a higher level. And then at level 19, I would recommend you take something like Maximize Spell, which maximizes the damage that you take from the damage that the spells do. And then the bonus spell that you got there, I would probably, the bonus feat, I would probably take Empower Spell. So that's the sort of setup I would do there. Now, the next step in the build is to choose spells. I'm going to really quickly just give you a couple of examples of what I would do here, but I think I'm not going to go through all the levels of spells and talk about what I would take at each level. I'll leave that for another video. But what I will say is that you've got to remember you're trying to cast spells at range here. So my recommendation for first level is to take Mage Armor. This is going to be one of your standard spells that you're going to use everywhere to improve your armor class. So take that. I mean, later on you can get a wand that will cast that for you, and it's fairly cheap. You might want to decide not to take this initially and use the wand later. It's entirely up to you, but I find it's a good spell at first level. And then really looking at what are the ranged spells. Now remember, Burning Hands and Color Spray aren't ranged spells at all. They do a cone that starts at you and goes out, say, 15 feet. So that's not actually range. You've got to be aware of that. Instead, you've got Ear-Piercing Scream. Flare Burst is in fact a ranged spell, and it does a target group from a 10-foot radius. Grease is another sort of area of effect spell. Hypnotism is another great area of effect spell. Magic Missile is definitely a ranged spell, and its advantage is it never misses, but it's very low damage, right? So it only does 2 to 5 points of damage, and the only way it increases is that you get up to 5 missiles by the time you get to 9th level. So even 5 missiles at 2 to 5 is only 10 to 25 points of damage. Not a huge amount. But at first level, because it always hits, it's quite good. Ray of Enfeeblement and Ray of Sickening are technically ranged spells, but they don't actually do damage. They just debuff your opponent. Shield is another spell that increases your armor class. It doesn't last as long as Mage Armor. So Mage Armor will last for several hours, whereas this will last for several minutes. But you could have Mage Armor on all the time and then cast Shield before a battle, or at the start of a battle if you wanted some. And it does stack, from what I've seen. Snowball is another one of your ranged attack spells. It does a nice amount of damage. And that's really it from the ranged sort of spells. It really comes down to actually doing damage, significant amounts of damage at range. It's really Snowball or Ear-Piercing Scream. And unless I took the water elemental and were doing frost damage, I would probably pick the Ear-Piercing Scream because it is sonic damage and it is therefore a little bit less likely that someone is going to have some resistance to that. They still have to do a save throw, but they're not going to have innate resistance to sonic attacks. So I'm going to choose that as my second spell at first level. So that's it. That's my my Sorcerer build. As I said, I will probably do some follow-up videos going through a lot more on the spells that you can take and what sort of things they do for you. I may do some more analysis of the Bloodlines. I'm definitely going to do builds for the other Sorcerer types as well, so keep an eye out for those. Make sure you share and like this video. Give me some comments if you've got ideas about great Sorcerer builds. As I said, the big advantage here is that the Halfling has no disadvantage to damage when being a Sorcerer. So give it a try, guys. Having your little Halfling Sorcerer run around casting spells can be great. Also, be aware that you could do this build as a gnome, but the Halfling has better stats to start off with as a Sorcerer. Thanks for that, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye.